Great. Okay, so the agenda is posted in the chat. We're going to have our three speakers. We ask that you save your questions there'll be a short Q&A after each speaker. And we can have Michele kick us off.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rose. And I want to just provide a little bit of context and a way to think about the landscape of plurality and the potential of plurality inside of organization. This is based on work and research that I've done. I've written a book recently called Humanocracy, which gets into some of these things a little bit more deeply. But in the interest of time, I'll just do a quick overview, and hopefully this provides a little bit of a framework for thinking about this stuff. So I'm going to share some slides to make this hopefully somewhat more interesting. Let's see here. Okay, cool. Let me know if you're not seeing the slide. Are you seeing the big slide?
Yes,
yeah.
I see them.
Okay, cool. So, in many ways, like there's never been a better time for people like us who are interested in plurality, and organizations, are recognizing the importance of diversity in the workplace, experimenting with different ways of, building more inclusive environments. And though this is great, it's welcome progress, right? But I think we have to come to terms with the fact that plurality doesn't really come naturally to many institutions, and that's kind of by design, right? So think for a moment about any kind of medium-sized, large organization you work for. So we heard earlier about MIT not being super plural. Perhaps it has these kinds of characteristics, which are, by the way, very common, right? The authority trickles from the top down. A few people set the agenda. Resource allocation happens more like it used to happen in the Soviet Union than Silicon Valley. People are slotted into very specific roles and very specific slots, and so you get slot-shaped contributions from them. There's a big infrastructure of compliance and control. Set the rules and make sure that they're followed. Your share of voice depends on where you sit, right, as opposed to whether or not you have meaningful things to say. And careers are all about kind of climbing the ladder, right, as opposed to accomplishing things that are truly amazing and advance the organization, right? And these are the features of bureaucracy, which sounds like a very old-fashioned term, like horsepower, and in many ways it is, but it is still the basic template of many organizations around the world. And the goal of bureaucracy and modern management, right, is really control and efficiency. And these are important things. Like, you want control, you want efficiency, you want to be able to drive cars that are cheap and and reliable, right? But these things are also problematic, right? Because let's see if I can advance the slide here. The bureaucratic practices that I mentioned earlier are informed by a set of principles that are very different from the principles of plurality. So things like hierarchy and alignment and a chain of command that is clear, right? These are important in a way to get efficiency at scale and control at scale, but they undermine the goals of plurality. Standardization makes sense, but when it becomes sacrosanct, it discourages anything new and different. Specialization is important, but when it gets ossified in separate units, it makes it really difficult to create bridges across different parts of the organization and come to a common view or solve problems across silos. And formal hierarchy stacks the deck right towards kind of old ways of thinking and shrinks the scope of employee initiative, right? And if you look at the data, it's really depressing. This is really about the point that I was making around employee initiative. Data from large scale surveys show that people have very little agency and little voice. 1 in 5 employees thinks that their opinions seem to count at work. Less than 1 in 10 thinks they can take risks, right, and to innovate and bring the organization forward, right? So these are again, not quirks, right? And it's something that hasn't really progressed or advanced or improved over time. The numbers have been bad for a long time, right? And so you basically have a system where a lot of brains are being put on ice. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to claim that companies waste more human capacity than they use. And in fact, they're very inhuman in that way. And okay, that's all the bad news I wanted to deliver, because I wanted to get those out early and maybe lay out a little bit of the challenge we face. But I'm very hopeful. And we're not stuck. There are a lot of good news. We can build plurality inside of established organizations, but I think we got to be really systematic and work hard at this. And I think the first thing we need to do is embrace a completely different set of principles from the ones that govern most organizations today. So if our goal is to maximize plurality, to harness diversity, to encourage fresh thinking, to foster collaboration across differences, you're not going to go with these principles of, which are really focused on efficiency. You probably have to embrace very different ones. And I would suggest that the list of principles would look something like this. And I'm sure there are other ones you would add to this, right? But it's a principle like ownership, having the autonomy to shape the direction of the organization and have a real stake in the outcome, the openness, the fact that you're harnessing ideas irrespective of where they come from, variety, having processes that are reliant on producing and making decisions on a ton of different opinions and points of view, right? And where you're experimenting all the time, having relational, community-driven processes for solving problems, harnessing the collective intelligence and the dynamism of markets, and subsidiarity, which is something we heard a lot about during the Plurality conference we had back in January, right? Pushing authority and discretion as far into the periphery, to the edge of the organization as possible. Now, I want to make this a little bit more tangible with maybe one example of how you take a principle, in this case, community, and you kind of inform the way organizations make decisions. Now, all of you, I'm sure, have heard, a canonical example of this is V Taiwan, right? Where instead of kind of, pushing decision-making down vertically, it was much more of a horizontal process. I want to give you an example of how you could do this inside of a company. This happened many years ago, well before Web 3.0 technologies and LLMs. And so we did it with Web 2.0 tools. But nonetheless, it gives you a sense of like what can happen. And this is in a company that is very large, in a retailer with over 60,000 people working in 30, 50, 40 countries. And it really started with an executive came in. She did her little listening tour around the world and noticed a real hunger on the part of the associates to create ways for the company to have much of an impact in the local communities where the stores were operating, where the associates lived. And these conversations crystallized in a retail-wide kind of crowd-solving initiative, as we called her. I called it early in her tenure. And it had this framing: how do we, as the company, dramatically multiply the impact we're having in our local communities? And it's a really interesting framing, but even more interesting to me was the approach that the company took, which it wasn't kind of top-down figuring out, here are the 5 priorities we're going to try to push everywhere, or asking a consultant, hey, what are the best practices for doing this? Rather, they involve the entire retail network to basically be part of the process of unearthing insights, ideas, sense making, and then eventually implementing them. And the effort took the better part of a year, and it was divided in 3 stages. And I'm going to go through these super quickly. And there was a set of stages of divergence and then convergence. So the first thing we did is we asked every employee to think about what are the challenges in your local community that you'd like to get solved. That then led to a store level conversation, and the stores filter all these ideas and pushed their nominations. We got 500 of those. The stores were then encouraged to look at each other's contributions and pick the ones that they felt was more interesting, more relevant to them. We have them bucket these into different categories, and we ended up with 10 challenges, supporting local artists, advancing the cause of schooling and education, especially in disadvantaged schools, helping local entrepreneurs and the like. And then we brought it back to each store and each individual in the store and said, pick one of these 10 challenges and think about what could you do in your store, maybe with some support from the center, but what kind of initiatives, projects might you drive to advance this particular challenge? And again, similar process, diverge, and then we converge. We ended up with the stores voting on each other's ideas and building on them, and landed on about 10 experiments. And the stores that proposed these experiments ran them with some support from the center. Lots of different initiatives were developed. Here are just 3 random ones. Not all of them succeeded, by the way. That's the whole point of doing experiments, but some of them did, and then they kind of laid the foundation for a network, retail-wide set of initiatives. And the more important legacy of this was that innovation and feedback started moving laterally and bottom up as opposed to kind of top down, and innovation became more of a social process. Now, as I said, we did this in 2015, 2016 with old school technology. I can imagine maybe one of the things I'd love to get your input on is, and maybe we'll talk about this with Aviv as well, like how might you do this differently to leverage all that we have now, the power of all our tools and technologies and mechanisms. All right, last thing I wanted to end with was a little framework to identify different ways of reimagining management practices, like the way the organization works, through the lens of plurality. And I call this the management model. Many of you probably are familiar with the business model. Well, you can kind of think systematically about different aspects of the organizational model as well. And so it's a set of processes and structural choices you make, right, that kind of govern how your organization works. And, we talked about how, through Taiwan, this retail example I shared with you, you can reimagine agenda setting by crowdsourcing it, but there's so many other approaches and opportunities to leverage plurality principles and tools to reimagine every single aspect of how our organization works. And so one of the things, and Jessica and Aviv will talk about some of these, so I don't want to steal their thunder, but in the remaining minutes we have, and I know we don't have a lot of time, Rose, but I'd love your feedback on this. Does this make sense? What's interesting? What's not interesting? What if of these opportunities you think are most interesting, most exciting to you? Are there others that I've completely missed? So that's it for me, and thanks for listening, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Michele. And I think what we'll need to do is save the comments and questions for the breakout and the reconvening there, and go straight into Jessica.
Hi. Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica. I'm from the Relation Labs. I didn't prepare any slides for today, so I'm going
no problem at all. Feel free to just speak casually.
Yeah, just a casual talk, but I'm happy to, I found a lot of interesting designing ideas that Mike have already talked about. But for me, today I'll be more focused on some single points that to talk about the power of the DAOs and the blockchain-based identity certificates in fostering the decentralization and plurality in the organizations. So the traditional organization today was very successful at bringing the modern businesses, the form of company, and the international global trade that helps the develop of the economy. But it has been criticized today because of the tendency to centralize authority that enforce conformity and discourage local experimentations. This results in the gross imbalance of human capacity. So as the develop in the edge now, helping people to to get together online and being more geographically decentralized can work together, and the development of the blockchain technology. Today, we are possible to explore some more possible solution that reimagine the organization, that is the DAOs. So as many of us already know the basic idea of the DAOs, the DAO, or the decentralized autonomous organizations, are the organizations that run by rules encoded as computer programs called the smart contracts, which are transparent and open to everyone. So it enables everyone anywhere to participate in the decision-making, the proposal ideas, and have a say in the governance of the organization. That's slightly different than the current organizations that maybe all the stakeholders will be a member of the DAO. And anybody can raise something like the proposal in a permissionless way and join the voting etc., and join the by way of join the governance of the organization. So there are many cases that the DAO works well in the funding or fundraising or distributor of funds, that is governing the assets. So it's been successful in empowering its members in making the collective decisions and invest in some innovative projects. So one successful example is the Moloch DAO. And it is a community-driven funding organization of the Ethereum-based projects and has distributed over millions in funding to date. But furthermore, today I want to talk about some blockchain-based identity certificates. And in our implementation, it can be the Soban tokens or any other form of tokens that it's possible to have the power to identify those who are underrepresented in the DAO and to discover plurality and to coordinate the members and assets in the organization. So these certificates can be the attestations, proofs, or achievements, or some other certificates of roles that are verifiable and tamper-proof, can help to ensure that everyone has an equal voice in the organization by the predefined rules, which is the mathematics. And the certificates must be compatible with the blockchain because that is vital for the innovation around DAOs. So how it works, I just gave some rough idea for the group, for the community here today. So you can also have your own input. So it should be compatible with the blockchain so that it can help the correct execution of the code. So it means the identity can import something to the blockchain with a transaction, and the blockchain, the smart contract, will correctly execute it according to the predefined rules and give us an output, or update the status of the blockchain by this way. And this way helps to ensure the consensus resistance, because everyone who wants to make the transaction and willing to pay the gas fee can actually make this transaction and see the results in the in a couple of minutes on chain. And we can also ensure the private participation of the identity. For example, in terms of voting, we can we should not know who vote for which candidate or even the voter at all. So this helps in the voting scenarios, and it can also help in many other scenarios by providing a more equal playing field for the nascent ideas, especially for the group of the employees or members who are typically marginalized. And these rules can be explored to set coordination members and resources like the roles and access to some information, to some resource. And we can set, for example, in some, let's see, some employment, we can set the basic minimum income for everybody here. And we can, for example, in the social media, we can set the basic minimum intention for everybody who wants to show themselves. So this is all by the algorithm designed by the smart contract code.
Thank you, Jessica. And I think we have time if you want to take one question or if you want to give a 1 minute wrap up.
Okay, I'm stopping here. So anybody who wants to raise a question, welcome to do so.
Okay, and if you have questions that come up, you can save them for a little later too. I guess we can jump right into Aviv and Michele.
All right. Thank you. Thanks again, Rose. So I promise I'm not going to go off on another like 10-minute presentation. This is really to basically help facilitate a conversation with Aviv, who has thought very deeply about leveraging collective intelligence across large groups. He's written a really cool paper, which I have right here. Aviv, I don't know if it's something that you can post a link to in case people want to check it out.
Sure.
But so we're going to use this as a little bit, the reference point for the conversation. And maybe, Aviv, I'll just start with, one basic question, which is, if you go talk to a lot of CEOs, and I have this opportunity, they will tell you, hey, we are having lots of ways for people to engage with us. We have surveys around engagement, we have town halls, we have all kinds of ways for people, we have task forces on specific issues, whatever. So like, why should I think about this any differently? And so like, it would be helpful to get your sense of what are the limitations of current approaches to eliciting feedback at large scale in organizations, and more importantly, what do you see as the methods that provide a better way to do this?
Yeah, thanks for facilitating. So that paper is about sort of what I'm calling is this umbrella of collective response systems, and it's a very particular set of properties and principles that are trying to get at what is missing in most of these types of organizational processes. And obviously there is no one size fits all. Everything is contextual. And you mean not like what I'm describing won't work for anything. There are places where it won't work, and there's specific variants. It'll be more appropriate in different contexts. But there's like, I guess, a few key principles, and I can actually bring up a slide. This was from the talk actually at the Plurality Institute, where I sort of went through in a lot more detail, like, okay, here's a collective response system, and it, everyone responds to a prompt, and everyone then can listen to that prompt, react to it, evaluate it, and then that's distilled. But what I want to focus on here is less this and more just like the set of properties that are really not found. And by the way, you're just seeing the PowerPoint, is that right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Is this the set of properties that are, I think, really important, that are not actually maintained in, let's say, a town hall, or like most mechanisms for organizational involvement don't actually allow everyone to contribute in a meaningful way. They don't sort of distill all of those contributions in a meaningful way. And they're often very inefficient. And so we saw with that process that you gave an example of, there is this convergent, divergent process, but that's over the course of a year. And that there are reasons why you might want to have a very long process for that goes really in depth. But what's amazing about this type of system is it's sort of doing all of that. It's facilitating all of that, but it's doing it very, very quickly. And so Polis is an example of a system that does this in a sense, right? Everyone can respond. It incorporates all those responses immediately, and then it distills them all in real time. And Remesh is another one where it actually lets you go divergent, convergent, over the course of 5 minutes per session. Per prompt. And there's a few things that make that work. These systems are designed to be collective oriented as opposed to individual oriented. So like, as a contrast, you can think about having like a Reddit equivalent on your, or a Slack, right? Those don't do the right kinds of things. They're not deliberation oriented. They don't, if everyone responds to a thing, what you see is the last thing, or you'll see the thing that was shown first, right? In a Reddit versus a Slack. Versus in Remesh, for example, you'll actually see everyone sees a sample of everyone else's things. They each evaluate that sample, and then that is the evaluations of every are inferred in a sense based off of all that data in very clever ways, using collaborative filtering and LLMs potentially. And so there is this sense of a fair hearing, that every single thing gets equal weight, unlike in, let's say, a Reddit or a Slack or a town hall or most of these other mechanisms. So I think that is really key, and also just the orientation compared to, let's say, even like a Facebook workplace. Another, like, it's like Facebook but for work, well, what is that? That still is engagement oriented in many ways, right? The same sort of mechanisms apply. And so there's a whole set of properties that I think are really, really valuable for exactly that question.
Yeah. So you're talking about first, a different use. So it's engagement, but not for its own sake. It's engagement to solve problems that are pretty concrete. So there is a problem architecture that governs and you're absolutely right about the efficiency, right? So this allows you to just process all this information far faster. And as you say, people have real voice and messages, individual contributions don't get missed out because they come at the last minute, or maybe they're the first ones, and so on. Now, how would you structure a process? Like, and you don't have to take the example I shared, but maybe some other. Like, what are the ingredients of like making sure that it's not just the tools, but you're creating a process that brings the most productive way of using these tools to getting to really compelling and unique and powerful answers? What are the ingredients for kind of architecting this as a as a process over time?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of like the cookie cutter answer versus the the diversity of answers that we don't have time to get into. I guess I would say if the major challenge is like they're very, very different perspectives across different parts of an organization, then something like Polis is like, there's a choice of tool, right? A Polis makes the most sense because it's built specifically for that, has bridging based ranking sort of at its core, and that is really the purpose. But Polis currently, and hopefully this may evolve, doesn't allow sort of the iterative questioning built into the system, and so it only allows a single convergent, a really divergent process component with a little bit of convergence. Whereas something like Remesh is doing, it doesn't give you that level of detail and sort of crispness around what are the bridging elements in the same way. But what it does do is it allows you to go divergent, convergent very, very quickly. And so like in some sense it's that. And then the other component is sort of the remit, like really figuring out how the framing of that set of questions and ensuring that people, like even asking as a question, like what is the most important thing we need to be exploring as an organization? What should the next question we give to the organization be, or to this subset of the organization? Like that is a question that you can ask in these contexts. And if you forget that, then you really miss the true power of this kind of tool.
Right. So you have to kind of create the right process. And I wonder, Aviv, you mentioned, posing a question like what opportunities lie, are we not exploring that we should? Or what are like threats looming over the horizon that we're completely blind to right now, right? So if you pose a question like that to the organization, I mean, what do you need beyond like having a great process and a great tool? What additional ingredients need to be in place so that people are maximizing the value of their answers, and you maximize the signal to noise ratio, right? Because I'm just thinking, just one example, just one analogy. Sometimes, at least in my experience with organizations, when they ask people for innovative ideas, they don't give them any framing or any tools for thinking what is an innovative idea? What do we mean by that? How do you develop innovative ideas? And so it's almost like telling someone who's never played golf, here's a set of clubs, now go to the fairway and we want you to hit the ball 200 yards straight. And it doesn't happen because the person hasn't got any training, right? So what are the kinds of things an organization needs to do to complement, a great process and a great kind of tool to maximize the quality of this deliberation?
Yeah, so I guess like I'm gonna sort of zoom and go into another sort of slide that might just help illustrate a bit, is that there really is this sort of spectrum of kinds of process, right? And so we talked about a few of these here, and I guess there's a lot to be said about sort of what the organizational culture and all of those types of pieces, but I think that's maybe out of scope here, beyond just saying that you want to ensure that people, there's just this sense of like safety to engage, and a lot of these tools can provide a type of like anonymity without the opportunity for malfeasance in a way that is maybe endemic in a number of other sort of tool structures, and just like sort of picking at what is the level of complexity for the problem at hand, and like when do you actually want to use something That's just like a survey. And sure, that's a fine thing to do versus like, a very basic survey where you're not giving people agency versus when do you want to use a collective response system, which only has a little bit more overhead, but gives you this generative output versus when do you really want to have some sort of deeper deliberation, which involves that much more that meatier human component. And so, I mean, I can't answer that for any particular, without a particular example, but I think that like really understanding that scope is going to be really important in making the right decision.
Right. And I think also, I don't know if you agree with this, it's thinking about like, what is the offline component that, like in V-Taiwan, right? So they complemented the Liberation Online with workshops that were facilitated where they got into much more detail. So just thinking about what's offline, what's online, how do you weave together the whole arc, right?
And I think it's totally fine to be using a tool like a collective response system while you're literally on a Zoom together, right? With, you can say, we're going to take an hour, we're going to do our all hands and, our all hands is going to be through this process. And that actually is a thing that companies do, right? Like it's just not every company does it. It's not mainstream, but it is definitely a thing that is done by companies where they have all hands on remesh. I don't know about Polis, but I assume that probably exists also.
And I'd love to open it up for questions, and maybe instead of doing a breakout, we kind of stick in here and if anyone has questions for the speakers. I guess I have a question I can put out there. When you see, organizations start to change and implement some of these systems, who often is it that's bringing the change? I don't know if you've come across any kind of patterns in that, like what role is often, helping to, launch some of these tools and kind of the why, like what in organizations that are wanting to shift from a more bureaucratic model, like what is it usually that's kind of tipping them over into wanting to implement some of these systems?
I can talk about this from one lens, but I think there may not be the specific lens that we're focusing on here, which is like I'm trying to get organizations to use these types of systems, but not actually focused internally, but focused externally, right? To the constituents, to the people they're impacting. And so that's been a larger focus of my work. And there, it really comes from people within that organization who they really want to understand what people outside of the organization who are impacted by it need, and how to actually mitigate the negative impacts, maximize the positive ones, make choices, make policies that are in line with their values, and also because they may just not even want to have their hand on the steering wheel as much as they want to decrease the extent of their hands on the steering wheel, because that exposes them to sort of stakeholder risk. It exposes them to people saying, why did you make that decision over this other one? Like, we don't feel like this is fair. And this is from the external perspective. And I imagine that a lot of that, I mean, most of my work focus has been external, like trying to get companies like Twitter and Meta and Facebook and so on to use these processes or the AI, AI organizations to use these processes externally focused. And I think that there's probably going to be a lot of similarity in terms of wanting to sort of not have their hands on the steering wheel because of all the potential conflict, and you're trying to find cooperation across difference.
Yeah, go for it, Andy. And then Pedar.
Yeah, thank you, Rose. We had hierarchical organizations in the past. The venture that we have right now is sort of very, very conducive to setting up a very, very diverse organization. So we're starting with a clean slate. There is absolutely nothing there. And I had been thinking about it, although we're still developing the technology and that will take some time yet. I've been thinking about the organization because I think it will be absolutely critical for the success. And, because we see it sort of going worldwide. And I'm thinking, how do you start? As an example, we likely need to have standards. We likely need to have practices of evaluating the right people, right? We cannot accept anybody within the organization because we want to create partnerships. And although we'll be paying the people at the same time, we want to encourage them to stay entrepreneurial and compensate them based on their success as well in a large portion of that compensation. So we're starting with a clean slate. How do we go about implementing a plurality type of organization? For anybody that has any thoughts, any ideas, and so on.
I might just say very quickly, don't read the Harvard Business Review or the McKinsey Quarterly, and do maybe the opposite of what they say. No, but in all seriousness, I think, this idea of starting with a new set of principles and saying, if we were serious about community, if we were serious about ownership, how might we reimagine these tasks of managing resource allocation, planning? Because those tasks don't go away. Because it's not so much about the what. You still need to plan. You still need to have the standards. It's more about the how, right? Because you could have a standard that is developed by a few people at the top of the organization without any local context, or you could have the standard developed collaboratively by people who are knowledgeable about that particular issue, right? So I think that would be my advice, and learn from the fringe. There are organizations, we didn't get into this much, but there are lots of organizations that are able to manage scale and complexity without bureaucracy. And so learn about what they're doing. But again, it's less about what they do and copying what they do and more how they think, and then applying those principles to your particular situation.
Thanks. And then we have Petar.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So excuse if my questions are a little dumb because I'm kind of new to your community. But what caught my attention was the analogy with Reddit and Twitter, and how essentially different posts, a different type of information from a large sort of set of community opinions is basically surfacing to you. And you're using this to bring this into your discussion that you care about designing mechanisms for organizations. But I just want to bring it back to software and just ask a simple question, maybe you have the answer to, which is immediately. So the line of reasoning is the following. So this constraint that you have a large amount of opinions being shared, even at the level of tweets or Reddits or small discussions, you have this embedded problem that how are you going to expose the readers plurally to all the sort of pieces of opinion that are being shared? And the natural question that immediately floats up is, obviously, your examples of Reddit and Twitter are two examples. So the constraint that readers always have is that the information ultimately obviously always comes in a ranked order, and you always have a chance to only sort of consume the first few pieces, because that's the cognitive sort of limit of people confronted with information. So computer scientists this problem gets really pegged down to you really need to, you're asking the question, how do I rank information to show it to the community? And so the Reddit and the Twitter example show two ranking choices, first versus last. The third obvious choice is like number of likes, which is kind of equivalent to one person, one vote. And my question is, one immediately sort of makes the connection and says, well, are there social systems like Reddit and Twitter that, for instance, use some kind of a plural mechanism for ranking, for instance, quadratic voting, as opposed to one person, one vote on the whatever tweets or other whatever is the format? Basically, there are.
I can answer that. I mean, Polis is a really good example of this, where it puts you into a cluster of people who kind of have beliefs that are similar to yours, and then it promotes information that bridges groups that disagree about things, but both agree on a statement. So it essentially ranks based on bridging and consensus. That's one example. I don't know how many more there are out in the ecosystem.
Got it. Thank you.
And if I can add a little bit there, just for context. So we do mention this a bit this is in the collective response systems paper. But the bridging systems paper is specifically focused on that, just that component of what is the like how do you rank in a way that bridges and sort of Polis is obviously a core example of that. But the other thing to sort of note is the way that a remesh or a Polis actually handles this in their interface in the voting process is they only show one thing at a time, or they'll only show two things, and you rank you put those in an ordering, and that's it. And then you see another thing, and they're shown to people either at random or in a way that maximizes information density to the ranking system, remesh and Polis respectively. So those are two specific answers to that question that get at the logjam, and that's why they actually have these properties that I listed.
And just a practical follow-up, is remesh in any way available for like sort of non-corporate folks to test out?
There are potentially ways to do that for governance contexts. But yeah, I can talk about that offline. Reach out to me, or we can connect you to the right people.
By the way, in a completely different use case, W.L. Gore, the makers of Gore-Tex and other materials, they rate people using a similar principle. So the way you get your performance review is not your boss reviewing you, but you have peers that have been exposed to your work over the course of a year. They're a big part of the system. And then the people that are exposed to you are teed up, you get teed up to them in addition to other people that they were exposed to. And then you basically have to decide, which is it Bob or Katie that had added the most value. You do a bunch of pairwise comparisons. And then what they do is, if you do enough of these, you get a hierarchy of contribution that is then used to drive compensation decisions. So you have a completely pluralistic way of doing performance review inside of a company, which is, again, pretty remarkable and still pretty rare. But you can apply, I think, this logic more than just deliberation.
Thank you. Michi?
Yeah, first, thank you for the great presentation. My question would be on how to push so we talked about collaborative innovation, but one of the challenges, I think, is how do you push stakeholder buy-in? So one of the example I'm thinking is participatory budgeting, which are seen around the world. But then the reality is only a few portion of the residents are interested or even willing to participate in that. So there's a huge problem of how to push people to be collaborative, to want to be that. And maybe in the case of companies, maybe there's an incentive of like success or payment, but then when we talk about public goods or redistribution, we can't just say no to someone who's not willing to. So my question is, how do we promote stakeholders to collaborate or even be interested in that?
Yeah, adoption.
Okay, I think I share a bit on this because I also work in the door-to-door visiting every week within our community. So in terms of politics, encourage people to get involved and in voting or in joining anything that they may not be aware or they may not be taken care of. So one thing is we have to engage them closer, no matter in person or virtually, but you need to let them aware of the things happening and know what the part they are interested in, and get them involved in some way that they are more interested in. For example, in the local community of Singapore, people may more be caring about the inflation, the cost of housing and education, etc. So this is the bread and butter things they may be more care of. So you just talk about these kind of things and get to know their concerns and visiting them frequently, so they know what's going on, and they have in the theoretical communication, you also know what's their concern. So this is the way, like in the politics, what we do. And virtually, I think, as I discussed in the DAO, maybe the algorithms can help a bit. So bring the attention to those who might be interested. That's a recommendation. And another way is that we can take in the incentives in the organizations for people to, let's see, people who vote, they can get some rewards. They join the decision making, they raise some proposals, they can get offer some rewards to provide some economic incentives for them to who be more active in these organizations.
Thank you. Just as a follow-up comment, I really agree with you. At the same time, I think changing the framing the problem setting or framing the question itself should be also collaborative, ideally. So I suppose practically it's necessary to frame the problem so that people would be more interested. But then at the end of the day, the framing of the problem is so important, and we need that collaborative process in that phase as well. So it's so hard, but thank you.
Thank you for that follow-up. Wes.
Yeah, so I wanted to push back maybe a bit on one of the points that I saw in in the first presentation about plurality and innovation specifically. I think it's useful to try to figure out what parts of an organization actually you would want some sort of plural input or plural system, and what parts you don't. And I think that innovation is a case where you don't want plural input. There was a study done by James Evans and Pierre Azoulay looking at the characteristics of teams that generate breakthrough papers. And the most predictive characteristic there is small team size, right? Small number of people. So I think of that as like in an innovative process, you want essentially high variance in output, and you get higher variance if you have like a smaller number of people that are working on a thing. So I just want to put that out there, see if there's any comments on that.
I think it's worth studying. I wonder to what extent large groups, because of all the communication failures that plural technologies are trying to solve, are essentially failing to innovate, because when a group gets too large, it's no longer able to generate good ideas because the tools are missing, whereas small teams continue to be able to do so. So it could be that actually that's exactly where these tools are needed, but that's just a hypothesis.
Yeah. I would then also separate out the work of teams and whether they're pluralistic, and then the process by which those teams and those ideas get funded and pushed forward, and whether that's pluralistic. And I was more referring to the latter. That is, you want a process that is highly experimental, highly divergent before you converge. And that's very dissimilar to typically the way innovation happens, which is sort of like cordoned off. They're like, here are the smart people, the R&D people, the innovation, skunkworks people. They'll come up with all the great ideas, and maybe they will, but often they don't, right? And the ideas come from the most unexpected places. And so you need to create an environment where ideas can come from anywhere, and people can get access to some capital, some experimental capital, and try things out, right? And so that's more where I was, focused on, like the actual process for resource allocation, for priority setting, and you want to make the process for generating those opportunities as pluralistic as possible. And because often it's not necessarily the individual idea, but rather the clustering of ideas that show a particular theme that was completely missed. And so, like, again, you don't get that if you converge too quickly on a few people and a few teams, and that in small groups.
Thanks. And I think Petar has a follow-up there too.
Yeah, so I wanted to sort of give an anecdotal sort of explanation why. So I fully agree with Wes. In my field, theoretical computer science, in the academic field, without having actually done any formal statistics, is almost all of the time sort of blatantly obvious that all of the award-winning papers and results are always like one, usually two authors. Everything else is down the line. This is like so obvious that you don't even need to do statistics, basically. To link this with, I think Michele is sort of, it is true that suddenly in different fields, so for instance, fields that require, computer systems or fields that require experimentation, this becomes exactly the opposite because you need, so there's the two effects going on. It sort of depends on what is the nature of the field. For the theoretical field, there's actually a very good kind of explanation why this is happening. In the theoretical field, so the research process, which requires lots of iterations through the techniques that you know about, iteration and recombination happens extremely fast in one person's brain. The minute people are working with a group of experts that have different fields, different expertise in computer science, the communication, verbal communication between them is extremely slow, so they can only interact with each other at the interface of what their field is doing without sort of going in the depth. So it's like the bandwidth of idea communication verbally versus mentally seems to be one explanation why you can't go deep if you're in a team, basically.
Thank you. Andy, did you want to jump in? David, you can go after Andy.
A very, very quick comment. Both Wes and Peter, I think, argue for the hierarchical organization. One or two people writing a paper have the best result. One or two people running an organization, no matter how big it is, will likely have the best results. And it's the paradox. And how do you reconcile that with the desires sort of self-actualization of the team and so on? And I think, and I like any reaction on this, I think you have some basic requirements for the organization. For example, the Silicon Valley Bank failed because they did not do certain things right. And that's a requirement. I consider that's a must do, right? They didn't do some basic things right. And then beyond that, you have the flexibility, to my mind, and I like the reaction on this, you have the flexibility of opening up the organization and say, okay, here is where we can have some input, some ideas, some thoughts for innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So two layers, and I'm trying to reconcile, and I was smiling, the point that Wes and Peter was making, that one or two people have the best results in terms of papers. And it's the same thing with an organization, let's face it, right? If you want to make a lot of money, you have one very good person run 100,000 person organization and do extremely well. So how do you reconcile the two?
Let me just jump in really quick and say it's 4 o'clock and our speakers are able to stay for another 15 minutes. So if you want to stay and keep going on this conversation, please do. If anyone needs to jump off, I just want to say thank you for joining. We wanted to continue the unconference, conversation from the conference, and thanks for being a part of our first experiment on this. And I guess I'll add my quick comment to your question, Wes, which is I had done a visit to the world's largest worker-owned cooperative, Mondragon, where all the workers, vote in all of the decisions, and they were really struggling with this exact question of how do they keep their organization innovative. And did a visit out to Silicon Valley to try to, learn some tips and tricks, but it definitely seems like
I would love to have like a breakout where we just talk about that. Was it possible to do that? Like you and me, Rose, and whoever else wants to join? Because we
might even be able to get the folks from Mondragon. Like we had them come out. They came to visit. They sent students from their university, and was a really interesting conversation.
And sorry, I just mean like right now. I just think that's a really interesting thing because I would love to go a little deeper into that. But I don't know if you want to continue in the wider conversation. If it's
let's just see. We had one more hand up, which was David.
Sure.
Can I just say, just to respond to that?
Okay.
So I don't think, Andy, that two people writing a paper is like bureaucracy or hierarchy. That's, to me, that's the exact opposite. It's about a small team that is pursuing their goals and without any bullshit that constrains them. So, and I would question your claim that having one smart person like Zuckerberg or whatever, running a company that is large is the key to success, because success eventually it's a self-correcting phenomenon. And if you're just relying on one person to be the all-knowing, all-seeing God, then, you know, you reach a point where that no longer works, you know. So so to me, like, the largest leverage in organizations is actually to start to think about how do we maximize the collective intelligence of everyone. And I think we're like 5% of the way there. And I would also say that Mondragon is an interesting example, because one of the things I love your take on, because plurality should not be confused, in my opinion, with lowest common denominator and necessarily consensus. Maybe sometimes you have consensus, but other times you actually want to diverge and respect that divergence, right? And because I can understand why consensus could hold you back, but I don't know if that's always necessary to have a plural organization.
Can I try to answer this?
Wait, David had a thing. I mean, he's
sorry.
been waiting patiently for a while.
Thanks.
Yeah,
David.
thanks.
We can go to you after.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in on this topic. I mean, I think the people that brought up academic research, I feel like are kind of describing the dynamic we're going after. Science is a plural organization. It's not like there's a head ministry of science that directs all research. It's a community that bubbles up ideas bottom up and then organizes itself in plural ways through journals and communities. And I think if someone suggested that we change the way we do science by having the, you know, world CEO of science that then top down directs how we do science, I don't think, I think we would agree that's not a really effective organization. So a corporation is similar. Like,
Petar?
Can I respond to? So I think I agree with the last three speakers, but I want to frame it in a way that I see it, and certainly the implication of what we've been saying with Wes, I think, is not that we are going for a dictatorship sort of thing. So notice that we said that theoretical science has like a small number of people producing results, but experimental science has a large number of people. If you want to make an analogy between science and corporations, you have to sort of realize that science only has impact when the information flows through the whole system. So first you have to have the breakthroughs that happen in like individual people's minds, but then they have to trickle through the experimental side before they actually have impact. So for the whole process to work, you need the two types. And notice that at both levels of, if you think of science as a corporation, at both levels, you have multiple people. The difference is that at the theoretical level, so you can think of it as you have the same number of people at both levels. At the theoretical level, you have a very low likelihood, very high impact results. So basically most people produce nothing, most individual teams produce nothing good, but you only need one. And then at the high level, you basically sort of churn these results into practice. So the reason why this is not the same as Zuckerberg is because the Zuckerberg picture is essentially, if he's the smart guy that we're sort of comparing to the theoretical scientist. The reason dictatorship means you have only one theoretical scientist and then you have all the applied sciences that are below him. But the way science works is you have lots of theoretical sciences and you're waiting for which one is going to have a breakthrough. And then you have the layer of experimental scientists, which need big groups of people and more consensus, basically.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And I think I see plural technologies as a mechanism for aggregating the work of the individual scientists and spreading that through the collective knowledge sphere. So it's like what we have with journals. As an individual scientist, you make a breakthrough, and then there's a system for that breakthrough to be shared and propagate. And that's kind of what we're trying to scale up.
Yeah, I guess I sort of see there being, again, this is maybe the the plural approach here, and if I can use that term, are we, by the way, are we still supposed to be recording?
Yes, we're still recording.
Okay. Okay. I wasn't sure if that was intentional or not. Okay. I see that as being, it's useful to have a bunch of small teams all doing crazy small bits, and it's useful to have a bunch of big teams doing like really big bets with a bunch of top-down folks, and it's useful to have everything in between. And all of those provide different types of advantages, and also work for different types of people, right? Some people prefer to not be their own entrepreneur. That's really stressful. Some people prefer to have a lot of freedom. Like it's just very, very different. And I guess like that brings me back to this question of like, well, what are the challenges that are being faced by organizations that have really tried to do this? And like I was thinking about the example of Mondragon, and they're like, maybe one of the challenges is that there's actually a thing like, it's really awkward to have a bunch of people who are working in this top-down place, and then also a bunch of people who are getting to do whatever they want, when there's just like, maybe there's different qualities of like that you need to get into those two different types of roles. And so maybe it's awkward organizationally to have there being that divergence in the same organization. And so that it's hard for them to even do both types of things, because there's no reason that you can imagine that would just be a priori impossible. And so I don't know if that's an actual challenge, but I can imagine that it would be, and I'd be curious if that really is a challenge to have that diversity of approaches within an organization that's trying to be a cooperative structure. And Rosa, I'm curious to hear if you have a sense of if that fits into it, but if someone else wants to jump in, what you saw in comparison to Silicon Valley approaches.
Well, one thing that was really interesting when the students came to visit is they were completely shocked and horrified that we were operating organizations that gave more equity to certain people as opposed to others. They're like, right. How can you feel good about yourself that you're taking more of this organization than your employees? It was just like baffling to them.
Yeah.
Which was
I visited them some time ago, and I should say, the Mondragon it's a complicated organization because most of the people actually are not part of the co-op. They're like in retail and banking and supermarkets. So they're not, so most of their employment is they're not necessarily owners of the company. And then there are parts of Mondragon and co-ops that are managed in a pluralistic way, but a lot of them are hierarchical co-ops, right, with management and workers. And so they're not that different. I mean, the thing that is kind of interesting is their governance process and these councils. And, so they do come to share points of view about certain things, where to invest, surplus and so on. But, it's sometimes I just couldn't tell the difference between like being at Mondragon and being at like General Motors in terms of how they ran the company, so I think it's a little different depending on where you are. It's such a large organization.
Yeah. And for some context, Mondragon, a cooperative, like I had initially thought, oh, it's like a health food store.
Oh no.
Yeah. It's a city. It's a whole, it's a city, a small
ecosystem.
What struck me visiting Mondragon was there was like no visible poverty, but there's also not a lot of visible wealth. It felt like very, very middle class. It was very interesting. They have their own banking system. They have their own healthcare system that goes on top of Spain's healthcare system. But it did seem like they were struggling with how to continue to innovate. And Michele, you were saying that like consensus is not the same as plurality. And I think that would be a really interesting case study, or kind of just like clear comparison of what does consensus model and organizations look like versus plurality in organizations. There are so many different models that we're comparing, and it is easy to think, oh, plurality, that's like similar to a consensus model, similar to a more flat model like consensus model, but it It doesn't, I mean, I even see this in housing and co-ops. I live in an intentional community, and we very intentionally did not want to have a consensus model decision making, because I've just seen it turn into a whole, big mess, while also balancing that with how do we give people veto power on really important decisions, and how do we kind of like take a duocracy approach of, if someone's motivated to do a thing, like harness that energy, give people an opportunity for feedback, but don't make every single decision need to go back to the entire collective and be deliberated. So anyway, would be interested in seeing if you know of any kind of comparisons between those models out there. Would love to see more on that.
I think there's also a really interesting tension between enlisting all the participants in an effort versus some individual or group having a vision. Like right now we have a model where a few people get together and they're like, we want to do this, who wants to come help? And they kind of direct the efforts of the organization. And over time, it becomes tempting to get everyone involved to give their input, but then the mission can change because they've recruited a bunch of people with other values, other interests, other risk profiles. And so there's this tension between, how much control does leadership or founders or whatever Vanguard has over the collective effort versus the aggregated values of all of the participants. And I don't know where the right line is.
Cool. Well, are there any other final questions or comments that anyone wants to put out before we wrap up for the day? No?
Thanks for the presenter.
My only plea, thank you so much for sticking with us, whether it's super early in the morning, in your case, Jessica, or super late for those on the West Coast. My only plea would be, if you find this interesting, you want to kind of talk about this, maybe advance the state of the art, or even have exact ideas to try in organizations, or organizations willing to try ideas. I'd love this to become a little interest group that continues, and because there's so much power in this way of thinking, I think, in the tools and that you guys, Jessica and Aviv, you've talked about, and so little of that being put into place, even experimentally. And so I think I'd be super excited to kind of join forces and see whether we can put some of these ideas into practice somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Cool. Awesome. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful weekend, and look forward to seeing you on a future unconference session with us.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.